In the early 1980s, deep behind the Iron Curtain, a strange-looking car began to appear in Soviet auto magazines and exhibitions. It was not a government-issued sedan or a rugged military vehicle. It looked more like something that had escaped from a Western car show, or maybe a sci-fi movie that did not have the budget to build a real spaceship. It had sharp angles, 6 headlights, and a sloped body that almost whispered the word Countach. This was the Pangolin GT, also known as the Pangolina 444 GT. Built in 1982, it was the dream of one man, Alexander Kulygin, and it has lived on as one of the strangest and most fascinating cars ever made in the Soviet Union. Alexander Kulygin was a Russian car builder who wanted to create something different from the typical Lada or Moskvich. Most Soviet cars were boxy, slow, and made more for function than style. But Kulygin had a different vision. He built the Pangolin GT on the frame of a Vaz 2101, which was also known as a Lada, and originally based on the Fiat 124. The car used a 1.2-liter L-series 4-cylinder engine that made about 62 horsepower. That is not enough power to scare anyone at a drag race, but for Kulygin, it was not about speed. It was about making something bold. The car had a fiberglass body laid over a steel frame. At first glance, people thought it looked like a Lamborghini Countach, with some lines from a Maserati Kamsin. It had a wedge-shaped body, with pop-up headlights, and a strange little periscope mirror on the roof. The mirror was inspired by an early prototype of the Countach that never made it to production. One of the strangest features was the way you entered the car. The entire roof tilted forward to let you in. There were no normal doors. Later, the car was modified and fitted with regular doors and a Targa-style roof, probably because people got tired of hitting their heads. In 1985, the Pangolina 444 GT was shown at Expo 85 in Bulgaria, where it caught some attention. It did not go into production, and nobody expected it to. Only one was ever built, but it made an impression. People in the Soviet car world joked about its 6 headlights and wild design. Some admired it, others laughed. One person reportedly said, "We, comrades, have 6 headlights," which might be the most Soviet thing ever said about a supercar. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Kulygin moved to the United States. There, he continued building cars, mostly kit cars based on the Pontiac Fiero. He kept chasing the dream of making something exciting on a budget. Sadly, in 2004, he died in a car crash. The Pangolin GT stayed in Russia. At some point it was painted red and changed a bit more. It still exists today, a little faded, but still very strange. The Pangolin GT is not a fast car. It is not a famous car. But it is one of the few times someone in the Soviet Union looked at a Lada and thought, "What if I made it into a spaceship?" In the early 1970s, deep in the heart of the Soviet Union, a curious little car came to life that almost nobody remembers today. It was small, front-wheel drive, and unlike anything else made behind the Iron Curtain at the time. The engineers at the Izhevsk machine-building plant, known as IGE, had a plan. They wanted to build something ahead of its time. They called it the IGE13 Start. Sounds like a science fiction project, right? But it was real. It had doors, wheels, an engine, and a pretty good shot at changing the Soviet car industry. Spoiler alert? It didn't. But the story of how it almost did is something most people have never heard. The IGE13 Start began development in 1968 at the IGE Design Bureau in the city of Izhevsk. A team of engineers led by Nikolai Ivanovich Slezarenko, designer V.A. Abraman, and bureau head Vladimir Evgenyevich Zorin worked on the prototype. Their supervisor was V.E. Blagozar Yumov, who helped guide the project. They were not just putting together another boxy Soviet sedan. They were trying to make something different, something more modern. They took inspiration from the French Renault 16, which was one of the first real hatchbacks in Europe. The idea was to give Soviet drivers something practical and roomy, but with better handling and comfort. The car they made was a 5-door hatchback, with a sloped rear and a modern look compared to the usual Moskvich or Lada shapes seen on the road. The IGE13 Start used a 1.5-liter engine from the Moskvich 412, but they tweaked it to give it close to 95 horsepower. That was decent power for a small car at the time. The engine was mounted longitudinally and tilted at a 45-degree angle to the right. That saved space and made the car's hood lower. The transmission was a custom design, using a short drive shaft and a reverse gear reducer, which was complicated. It used heavy universal joints instead of constant velocity joints, which made the front suspension wear out faster than a Soviet washing machine. The car had independent suspension in the front and rear, borrowed and modified from the Moskvich 412. The body weighed less than 1,985 pounds, and with its 95 horsepower engine, the IGE13 could hit 100 kilometers per hour, or about 62 miles per hour, in around 12 seconds. It topped out at about 102 miles per hour, which was not bad for a car that never made it to production. Only one prototype of the IGE13 Start was built by 1972. The car had promise, but state officials were not ready to invest in a new front-wheel drive design. Soviet industries were busy building the familiar rear-wheel drive Moskvich and Lada models. The Start was too different and too risky, so the project was shelved. The prototype was sent to a museum, where it still sits today, probably wondering what it did wrong. Later, Izhevsk would return to front-wheel drive cars like the IGE2126 Oda and the IGE Orbita, but those came in the 1980s and 1990s, long after the IGE13 had disappeared from the plans. The IGE13 Start was one of the Soviet Union's quiet what-ifs. It did not get the fame of a Lada or the legacy of a Volga, but it was a small, ambitious machine built by a team that dared to try something new, even if they only got one shot. In 1960, deep in the Soviet Union, a sleek, strange-looking car rolled out of a workshop. Not a fancy European factory, but a university lab. It was called the Hottie 5. Most people have never heard of it. Even car fans who know every Ferrari and Lotus might look confused if you bring up the Hottie 5. But this one-of-a-kind Soviet creation was real. It had 4 wheels, a fast engine, and a name that sounded more like a secret weapon than a sports car. This is the story of the Hottie 5, a record-setting concept car that no one ever got to drive to the grocery store. The Hottie 5 was designed by Vladimir Nikitin, a Soviet engineer who worked closely with student teams at the Kharkiv Automobile and Road Institute. That is where the Hottie name came from. It stood for Kharkiv Automobile and Road Institute, just in Russian. They were not trying to build a mass-market car. They were chasing speed records, and the Hottie 5 was their 5th attempt. It followed the earlier Hottie 1 through Hottie 4, which were also experimental vehicles that most people outside the Soviet Union never saw. The Hottie 5 was low and smooth, made for racing across salt flats or test tracks, not for city traffic. Its body was streamlined and shaped to cut through the air with as little drag as possible. It had a rear-wheel drive layout with independent suspension on all 4 wheels. That was not common in 1960, especially in the Eastern Bloc, where car technology often lagged behind. Under the rear hood, the Hottie 5 carried a 4-cylinder engine with about 3.0 liters of displacement. It could produce around 126 horsepower at 4,500 revolutions per minute. For a car that only weighed around 2,200 pounds, that was decent power. It had a 3-speed gearbox, which today might make you laugh, but back then was typical for performance cars. The car measured roughly 14 feet long. Nobody really knows how fast it could go, because few official records survived. Some say it reached very high speeds during test runs, but the Soviet Union was not exactly famous for open data. There were no big press releases, no race trophies, and no production line. Just a car, a team of engineers, and a quiet dream of breaking records. The Hottie 5 never made it to dealerships. It never entered mass production. It never became a name like Corvette or Mustang. But it did end up in history. In 1986, a postcard series was published in Moscow under the Planeta label. These postcards featured Soviet sports cars, including a card that showed the Hottie 5 in all its shiny glory. The set was called History of the Automobile. Each card measured about 9 by 14 centimeters, and over 165,000 were printed. It became a collector's item, even though most people did not know what they were collecting. Today, you might find Hottie 5 postcards on auction websites or in dusty corners of car museums. Vladimir Nikitin is not a household name, and the Kharkiv Institute is not known for building sports cars. But once, in 1960, they built a car called the Hottie 5. It did not change the world, but it did leave a mark. One smooth, silver, rear-engine mark. And that is more than most cars ever do. In the early 1980s, deep inside the Soviet Union, a strange-looking vehicle began to take shape. It did not roar onto the streets or make headlines in car magazines. Most people have never heard of it. But in 1981, a quiet experiment by AvtoVAZ and a Soviet research group called Vinayite introduced something the world would not fully understand until much later. It was called the Lada X1. At first glance, it looked like something from a science fiction comic book. At second glance, it still looked that way. But the story behind it is full of surprises, missed chances, and a little bit of Soviet humor. The Lada X1 was created by AvtoVAZ, the well-known car manufacturer in the Soviet Union, together with Vinayite, the Central Scientific Research Automobile and Automotive Engines Institute. The goal was to design a vehicle that would suit families in the year 2000, so they called it a car of the future. This was not just a fancy label. The X1 had ideas that were way ahead of its time. The first model they made was a full-size version made out of plasticine, which is like very thick modeling clay. They also made a smaller version at 1/5 scale out of plastic. The body of the Lada X1 was shaped like a drop of water. Its front end sloped down smoothly, and the headlights were oddly placed up near the windshield. The total length was around 165 inches, which made it just a little longer than a Volkswagen Golf Mark II. But the real shock was inside the vehicle. The Lada X1 was built to seat 7 people. The seats could swivel, slide, and fold in different ways. The third row could be completely reconfigured. Some seats could even turn into small tables. It was like a living room on wheels, except you would not want to spill tea during a sharp turn. The X1 never had a working engine. It was only a prototype, never a real car. But many believe it might have used a similar powertrain to the Lada 2100 or Lada Riva models if it had been made real. It did not get to go through road testing. It just sat there looking weird and futuristic, like the shy kid at a party who had good ideas, but no ride home. Later, in 1982, AvtoVAZ and Vinayite created a follow-up called the Lada X2. That one was also just a concept. The X1 and X2 both shared the same dream, to make vehicles that were more like mobile rooms than just transportation boxes. Though they were made in a time when most Soviet cars looked like bricks with wheels, these concepts imagined something softer, more flexible, and oddly family-friendly. Even though the Lada X1 was never built for real use, it was one of the earliest signs that car makers were thinking beyond speed and steel. They were thinking about how people lived inside their vehicles. It was a small clay step toward minivans and multi-purpose vehicles that would come much later in Europe, Japan, and America. The Lada X1 might have been funny-looking, but it was not a joke. It was a strange but serious attempt to look ahead, just without a working engine.